Tonight we begin with a development that US officials had feared, dismissed and ultimately failed to prevent, a move that unfolded not over weeks but in hours, hours that changed the trajectory of this war, hours that sent shockwaves through the Pentagon, hours that left the White House scrambling for answers. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that Washington had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with precision, with fury, with a message that echoed far beyond the battlefield. This is not the story of a victim begging for help. This is the story of a nation that has learned to fight back, and a world that is only now beginning to understand just how serious this moment has become. Because what happened in the last 48 hours wasn't just an escalation, it was a signal. And everyone from Moscow to Washington to Brussels is now trying to figure out what comes next. For weeks now, there had been signals, not from official statements, not from Kremlin press releases, just signals that Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a choreography that Western intelligence agencies had grown accustomed to reading. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the movement of mobile command units, the repositioning of strategic aviation assets, the sudden activation of long-dormant radar installations, the unexplained withdrawal of diplomatic personnel from key embassies. All of that went quiet, and whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. For the past 3 years, the world has watched Russia and Ukraine locked in a grinding war of attrition, cities reduced to rubble, civilians caught in crossfire, soldiers on both sides dying by the thousands. But through it all there were understood limits, boundaries that both sides had tacitly agreed not to cross, until now. Because what Putin authorized this week wasn't just another missile barrage, it wasn't just another wave of drone attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. It was something that intelligence officials in multiple NATO countries are now describing as a deliberate provocation designed to test the breaking point of Western resolve. And the White House's reaction tells you everything you need to know about how serious this has become. Early Thursday morning, US intelligence satellites detected what they described as unprecedented military activity deep inside Russian territory, including the mobilization of strategic bomber units that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they're signaling something very specific, escalation, deterrence, or preparation for a major offensive. Pentagon officials didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing his posture. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by a small margin, Washington pays attention. Within hours, the situation became clearer and far more alarming. Russian forces launched a coordinated strike on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure that exceeded anything we've seen since the first weeks of the invasion. Power stations, water treatment facilities, hospitals and communication networks were hit simultaneously across multiple oblasts. But that wasn't what crossed the line. What crossed the line was the use of weapons that Russia had previously held in reserve, hypersonic missiles equipped with enhanced payloads deployed against targets that had no military value whatsoever. This wasn't about degrading Ukraine's fighting capacity. This was about inflicting maximum civilian suffering. And the world noticed. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior officials after an emergency National Security Council meeting described Putin's move as reckless, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, indicative of a regime that is running out of options. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. In fact, Ukraine's response today was among the most aggressive and strategically brilliant we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of the Russian strikes, Ukraine launched a coordinated counteroffensive targeting Russian military assets deep behind enemy lines. These weren't the symbolic drone attacks we've grown accustomed to seeing. These were precision strikes using advanced Western-supplied munitions. Systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the battlefield equation. And they did exactly that. Tonight, Ukrainian military command confirmed that they launched precision strikes on 17 Russian military installations, including a major logistics hub in Kursk Oblast that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was preparation for a renewed ground offensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could execute their next phase. They hit fuel depots that supplied frontline units. They hit ammunition storage facilities containing newly delivered Iranian drones. They hit command and control centers that were coordinating the very attacks that had devastated Ukrainian cities hours earlier. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's offensive capability, the infrastructure that would have made their next wave of attacks operational. This is what made the White House's warning so urgent. Putin's escalation wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally shift the balance of this conflict if left unchecked, and Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't target Russian civilian areas. They didn't strike nuclear facilities or population centers. They hit military targets. They hit logistical nodes. They hit the exact pressure points that would cause maximum disruption to Russian operations while minimizing the risk of uncontrolled escalation. That's not the response of a desperate nation. That's the response of a military that has learned, adapted, and evolved into something Russia never anticipated. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Putin's latest escalation was designed to test the cohesion of NATO support after months of political uncertainty in Washington. Putin wanted to see whether Western leaders would waver, whether congressional gridlock would paralyze American resolve, whether European unity would crack under the pressure of energy concerns and war fatigue. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't wait for permission. They didn't consult with committees. They launched a response that was so swift, so comprehensive, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Putin's attention easily. But today Zelensky did. Defense analysts speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's tactical shift as probing, a way to identify weaknesses in the alliance supporting Ukraine. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and determined. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian air defense systems were overwhelmed before they could respond effectively. That precision matters because it shows Ukraine has achieved something remarkable: battlefield intelligence superiority in specific operational windows. It shows that Ukraine is not merely surviving this war, they are actively shaping it. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force assets carried out long-range strikes using Storm Shadow missiles, forcing Russian commanders to relocate critical personnel. Ukrainian ground forces targeted a railway junction in Belgorod Oblast that had been used to transport armored vehicles in the last 72 hours. Ukrainian special operations units operating behind enemy lines reportedly disabled communication towers used by Russian forces to coordinate attacks on civilian infrastructure. This wasn't just retaliation. This wasn't just defense. This was strategic degradation. This was battlefield shaping. And battlefield shaping is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed siege of Kyiv. For every territorial advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Russian logistics, disrupts their command structure, and forces them to defend territory they thought was secure. Remember, Putin thought this war would last 3 days. He thought Kyiv would fall within a week. He thought Zelensky would flee to exile. He thought NATO would fracture under pressure. He thought Ukraine would collapse under the weight of his military machine. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is fighting back with capabilities that didn't exist 2 years ago. NATO is more unified than it has been in decades. And Putin is facing the very isolation he tried to impose on Ukraine. The irony is impossible to ignore. Every escalation Russia has attempted has been met with an adaptation that makes Ukraine stronger. Every line Russia has crossed has resulted in new weapons, new support, and new resolve from the international community. And tonight, that pattern continued. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's latest move happened at a time when the Russian president is under enormous internal pressure. Hardliners in the military want total mobilization. Oligarchs want an end to sanctions that are strangling their wealth. Nationalist factions want territorial conquest that Putin has failed to deliver. Pragmatists want a negotiated exit that preserves Russian dignity. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war that has cost Russia hundreds of thousands of casualties and hundreds of billions of dollars. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. That's what makes this moment so unpredictable. A cornered leader with nuclear weapons is not a leader who makes rational decisions, and the White House knows it. The White House's statement, now circulating through diplomatic channels worldwide, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow this escalation to go unanswered. Administration officials said plainly that Russia's attacks on civilian infrastructure were inconsistent with international humanitarian law. That is diplomatic language for this is a war crime and we are watching. You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something serious is at stake. But beyond words, actions followed. Reports indicate that emergency consultations are underway with NATO allies about accelerating weapons deliveries to Ukraine. Additional air defense systems, including Patriot batteries, are reportedly being prepared for immediate transfer, and most significantly, restrictions on the use of certain long-range weapons are being reconsidered at the highest levels of the Pentagon. Putin's escalation may have just unlocked the very capabilities he was trying to prevent Ukraine from receiving. Meanwhile, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a defiant, emotional speech tonight. He said, "They bomb our hospitals and we strike their military bases. They target our children and we target their war machine. This is not revenge, this is justice." He said, "Every missile they launch strengthens our resolve. Every attack on our infrastructure accelerates their defeat." And he said to our allies, "We do not ask you to fight for us. We ask only that you give us the tools. We will do the rest." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. And the world is listening. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, Russian naval forces in the Black Sea also increased activity near Ukrainian shipping lanes. Belarusian military units conducted exercises along the northern border, raising concerns about a potential second front threat. Russian cyber operations increased attacks targeting Ukrainian banking systems and government networks. All of this happened within the same 48-hour period. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway, whether that's preparation for a major offensive, an attempt to force negotiations on his terms, or simply a demonstration of capability designed to intimidate. No one is entirely certain, but everyone is taking it seriously. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a spring offensive designed to capture additional territory before potential political changes in Washington. Another is that Putin is attempting to create enough destruction that Ukraine is forced to the negotiating table under unfavorable conditions. Third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to fracture Western unity by demonstrating that supporting Ukraine comes with escalating costs. But today, Zelensky took that card off the table. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't engage in diplomatic protests. He didn't appeal to international bodies that have proven toothless. He struck back with everything Ukraine had available, and in doing so, he sent a message that no amount of Russian escalation will go unanswered. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see if the West will blink. Zelensky wants to show that Ukraine will never surrender. Washington wants to prevent this conflict from spiraling into something larger, and Europe wants to prevent the consequences of a Russian victory from reaching their borders. Everyone has something at stake, and the decisions made in the next few weeks could determine the trajectory of this conflict for years to come. Tonight, we've heard from NATO officials who are now monitoring Russian force movements with heightened concern. They say Russian units are repositioning in ways that suggest preparation for sustained operations. They say communication intercepts indicate frustration within Russian command structures about the effectiveness of Ukrainian countermeasures. And they say Putin's decision to escalate is likely part of a broader strategy intended to create a sense of crisis before any potential diplomatic engagement. But Ukraine is not backing down. In fact, Ukraine is doubling down. Their response today, swift, precise, and devastating, sent a message to Moscow that escalation will be met with escalation. And it sent a message to Washington that Ukraine remains a capable and reliable partner worth supporting. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this latest round of attacks. But what we do know is that the White House's response was timely. It rallied international condemnation, it accelerated military support discussions, and it demonstrated that the alliance supporting Ukraine remains intact. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he de-escalates, this moment will be remembered as a failed gambit. If he continues down this path, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Putin appears to be uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is choosing his next move carefully, because tonight Putin learns something he has learned many times but refuses to accept. Ukraine will not break. The West will not abandon them. And every escalation he attempts will be met with consequences he cannot predict. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Zelensky made Russia pay. The White House is scrambling to catch up, and the world is watching to see what happens next. And we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.